Rain seems like one of the more straightforward things to animate, but there's still things that you should know in order to make a rain animation that really feels believable. The lines you draw will generally all come from roughly the same direction. They can all be perfectly parallel, but don't have to be. A light drizzle will most likely have more parallel drops going near straight down, assuming there isn't a lot of wind. In contrast to this, a scene where it is pouring and stormy can have the drops coming down at a slant and going in more wildly different directions, getting pushed around by the wind. Still though, there will always be a general direction that the drops will come from. It will help you to have a guideline layer placed underneath that is a series of parallel lines indicating the overall slant of your rain, since it's easy to get tunnel vision and accidentally start changing the overall direction of the rain as you draw it from one side to another. These examples so far are all fitting for environments in 1 or 2 point perspective, but 3 point perspective will work a little differently. I don't want to turn this into a lesson on perspective, but as a quick explanation, you can tell a scene is in 1 or 2 point if the vertical edges of a cube would all appear parallel to each other. In 3 point, these edges are not parallel and instead point towards a shared vanishing point. This is good for the impression that you're looking up or down at something. You can tell that this scene is in 3 point perspective because the vertical trees are slanting inward, pointing towards that vanishing point located somewhere above. If you want to animate rain over a scene where you are looking up at a character like this, you can have your raindrops come roughly from that vanishing point. Compared to just animating the rain falling down in an overall parallel way, this really gives the scene a proper feeling of depth. When drawing your droplet lines, use a very thin brush. It's a very common beginner mistake to make your lines too thick. You don't need to use a straight line tool, but try to make your lines as straight as possible. If you have a difficult time with that and your lines tend to curve or curl at their ends, be sure to draw with your arm instead of your wrist. Basically, your wrist should stay straight, not bending as you draw. You should vary the length of your lines as well as the spacing. Evenly spaced droplets look unnatural, so put some closer together than others. And finally, if your program has the option, add a bit of motion blur as the final touch. When drawing your next frames, avoid making lines that overlap with the lines in your previous frame. Try to fill in spaces that were previously empty. Also, you don't need to worry about continuing the same drops and figuring out where each and every one of them ends, but it can look nice to do that for some of them. Just be sure that the space between frames is large, since rain falls very fast. I recommend making at least 4 frames before you loop it back to the first. If you play your animation and notice that there is any area where a droplet seems to be strangely hovering around in place instead of falling down, that means that you accidentally drew a line in that general spot multiple times. A very easy mistake that's hard to avoid but easy to fix. You can just erase some of the instances of there being a line in that spot, and that'll do the trick. Just like everything else, rain droplets get smaller as they get farther back in perspective. In a program where you have layers and the ability to scale stuff in them, this can be pretty quickly achieved by duplicating and resizing clumps of drops. If that isn't an option for you, just try changing your brush size and drawing various sized drops of rain. And be sure to avoid droplets that are meant to be really far away, layering in front of any closer objects you have in the scene. For those of you with layers, you can separate your background into multiple layers, like my background, middle ground, and foreground I have here. Then you can put your rain layers between these and avoid layering issues altogether. Related to this, don't make the mistake of not covering the entire scene. For example, you might forget to include any rain layered in front of a character or other object. Unless there's some overhang blocking the rain from reaching certain areas, it should layer over everything, not just the sky or background. Your animation will feel especially realistic and believable if the background you draw or paint feels fitting for the rainy weather. Many surfaces will take on a sort of shininess when they are wet, and in hard ground surfaces like asphalt you can see reflections. Here are some references for that. When rain hits hard ground, it spatters. The easiest way to animate this effect is with randomly placed little splash dots on surfaces that are being hit. Keep in mind the material of your surfaces. Rain will bounce right off of a rock, while something softer like fur is absorbent and likely won't create any sort of spatter, instead just soaking it right in. When rain lands in a puddle or other body of water, you'll get more of a tiny splash and ripples. You can get very detailed and put in a lot of effort into animating these water splashes, and there's an abundance of slow motion videos out there for reference. But unlike in those slowed down videos, the actual action happens incredibly fast, just in the blink of an eye basically, so you don't need to make anything super complicated and instead can simplify. Maybe you have 1 or 2 frames that are the splash and droplets flying up, and 1 or 2 that are the resulting ripples. These splashes can be drawn according to where your raindrops should land, but this is another case where you don't necessarily need to do this perfectly. Having every single splash connect to a previous frame's raindrop is not worth the trouble. The color you should use for your lines depends on the environment. It's obvious said out loud, but rain is water, and water reflects what is around it. A safe bet is to color pick the main color in the environment and lighten it a bit. Whatever light exists in the scene will catch on the drops, so within the range of something like a flashlight emitting pale yellow light, the rain will be brighter and match that color. Ideally, the raindrops should be a bit lighter than whatever they are drawn on top of, so use a blending mode if you can, or just change the color you're using in certain areas if you need to. Here are some more animation tutorials. Hope you found this one helpful. Thanks for watching!